Hello, everyone. I'm here today with a special guest, Mitch Li, MD. Dr. Li and I met on his Facebook group because my friend Paul tagged me. Someone was asking about dentists that were involved in these kinds of things that we're going to talk about. And I joined the group and I was like, whoa, my eyes were open when I started reading some of the posts. I didn't post for a while, but I'm posting there as well now. But I want to take a minute and talk about the fact that the reason we're discussing what we're discussing is that the corporate intrusion into healthcare. And I see what's happening to us happen to physicians 20, 30 years ago, or maybe even longer. So I want Dr. Li to introduce himself and tell me a little about yourself. Tell me about how you got into this. Kind of tell me where you are, because I know where you are and it's kind of interesting. And the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me, and you can call me Mitch. But I'm super excited to see that there's some of this movement coming together in the dentistry world and in the veterinarian world. We're talking to some vets who are seeing the same thing, probably in a similar place to where dentists are in terms of starting to have a lot of rapid corporate intrusion, but for a while have kind of held back that tide compared to the profession of human medicine. And yeah, where I physically am, I'm in North Carolina, and I'm currently, if we freeze up here, I am on Starlink. It's Elon Musk's fault. Although I will say that it's nice and freeing actually to have that satellite internet, because I'm out in rural Western North Carolina in a converted cargo trailer, because I'm putting some land together out here, sort of little my camper workshop shed thing that eventually I'll convert the rest of the way and take to some national parks, and that'll be my boondocker. So anyway, yeah, I have a group called Take Medicine Back, which is taking the profession of medicine back from corporate interests. And we are just absolutely in crisis in the profession of medicine, which barely exists at this point. And, by extension, the healthcare system. We're in really rough shape at any metric that you cut it, in terms of the affordability of healthcare for people, the kind of medical debt people go into, and then the complete lack of autonomy that physicians have in the system. So now the figure is about 80% of physicians are employed by corporations. And by that, we mean lay corporations, corporations that are not entirely composed of physicians. And that includes hospitals, which a lot of us don't think of them as corporations, even academic centers, quote unquote nonprofits. They're not really behaving the way we'd expect a locally accountable nonprofit charitable institution to behave. Those are kind of from a bygone era. So everything from hospitals to insurance companies with 1 out of 10 physicians, likely much more now, employed or under contract with Optum, United, and many more employed by tech companies, pretty much the whole gamut, the whole spectrum, and now private equity as well, which private equity firms and sometimes try to give the illusion that they're helping physicians stay independent from the hospital systems, but you're just jumping from one frying pan to another. You're now controlled by private equity firms, and that's been one of the most insidious entrances of corporations and Wall Street into medicine over the past 10 to 20 years.
Wow. Yeah, it's eye-opening, and I appreciate you inviting me and my friend Christine from the Alliance of Independent Dentists to that meeting. And I all I could think about is I don't want dentistry to be at that point. Right now, we have 13% of dentists working in corporate dentistry. Now, it's basically an average, like the states like Nevada and Florida are close to 20, and it kind of drops, but it's 13%. We still have time to make sure we can keep most of us independent. So I want to make sure that dentistry stays independent, at least most of us. And I want to see the government enforce the laws that are there for the ownership of a practice of dentistry, and they have not done that. There are loopholes now. Tell me a little bit about the history and how did this happen to medicine? I'm sure you have the stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man. Well, so let me ask you first. It sounds like you are referring to corporate practice of dentistry laws that do exist. Does that sound like that exists in your world, even if the majority of you still have independent practices? Are there laws that you're aware of or prohibitions on the corporate practice of dentistry?
You know, I am not an expert in that, but for the longest time, I had heard that a dental practice can only be owned by a dentist in the state of Illinois, right? And all of a sudden, it starts changing. Now, there are states like Pennsylvania that is very liberal on that, and it allows anyone to own, you know, and I looked it up. It says that they can own it, but they have to stay out of recommending treatment. I talked to a young dentist that told me that the office manager is telling them, and I'm not going to exactly say what procedure because I'm afraid it's going to identify him, to do a certain procedure on patients where it is not necessary. And yes, we use it on certain patients, but it's not for every patient. And
Mhm.
that is exactly against the law. This person owns the part of the ownership. And that's what I want to do. I want to make sure we are active enough looking into every law in every state and then enforce it, people, and don't let loopholes get in.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the one case that comes to mind that's very explicit, and I don't want to get details wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, it was Aspen Dental, and an attorney general in New York took action against Aspen Dental under the concept of the corporate practice of medicine. And I think sometimes corporate practice of medicine laws, prohibitions are extrapolated to dentistry, even if it wasn't explicit previously. But in my understanding, Aspen Dental was essentially directing the dentist to do unnecessary procedures, perhaps with Medicaid patients, children, and doing unnecessary procedures. And a lot of these things can be subtle, right? It's not always the smoking gun of the administrator or the owner saying, do more of these procedures. Sometimes it is, but other times you're rewarded based on metrics. You are carrot and stick, so you are chastised if you're not getting your quote unquote productivity up. You might be threatened with job loss if you don't get your quote unquote productivity up. They might start advertising directly to the patient these services, so they're now pressuring you as the dentist or the physician for them, similar to direct to consumer advertising of medications. Ask your doctor about this. Well, now the pharmacist, or not the pharmacist, the pharmaceutical companies are practicing medicine by pressuring us. Even narcotics, actually, which I'm sure overlaps with dentistry, that was Purdue Pharmaceuticals that actually started the whole pain score, the 0 to 10. That was, as the fifth, pain is the fifth vital sign. I always talk to students and others about, tell me about these vital signs. Tell me about blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and pulse ox. And I say, what happens when those all go down to zero? And the patient's dead. But what happens when the pain goes down to zero? You're fine. What happens when the pain goes to 10? Well, you're definitely alive. So there's one of these is not like the other. And pain as a fifth vital sign was a push from the pharmaceutical company to get essentially nurses chastising under what they thought was the right thing. It's noble to get to treat the patient's pain, but the goal was to get the pain to zero, which was an unreasonable goal, and that essentially manipulated physicians to prescribe narcotics, or they were chastised as the bad physician. So it's incredible how much corporations and pharma have exerted themselves on our profession for decades, and it's just so much worse. So I can tell you about the history of, I love the history of medicine. It's crazy, disturbing, awesome, and it teaches us so much. So the corporate practice of medicine, I love the etiology of this. Now, the American Medical Association Council on Medical Services report from 2013 recognizes the corporate practice of medicine as integral to providing an ethical basis for the practice of medicine. It was integral to elevating the profession and the autonomy of the profession and providing an ethical basis. So that makes it just blow my mind that this is essentially the ethical basis of the practice of medicine. We don't learn about it in medical school or afterwards. And so if we don't have an ethical basis to our profession, then what do we have? So the AMA today explicitly allows you to sell your practice to a corporate entity and even tells you how to do it. They basically got a guide on how to do it. And they say it's a very exciting opportunity. Now, I can't put all blame on the AMA for this, and there's plenty of reasons to be dissatisfied with the American Medical Association. I don't know about the ADA, but the AMA represents maybe 10 to 12% of practicing physicians at this point. It's estimated. They're not exactly publishing this because they don't want to advertise that fact. But suffice to say, it's really not representative of the practicing physician. But we go back to the 1970s, and as much as I didn't really like the AMA, I kind of feel that the government actually screwed this one up a little bit, maybe more than a little bit back in the 1970s. We'll go back a bit further than that to the first Gilded Age, maybe to early 1800s and the Industrial Revolution. Technology, we get all this technology and we can make things more automated, and we talk about the trickle down effect, right? Well, the trickle down effect was supposed to make everybody's daily lives easier, and automation was supposed to make everybody have a nice personal assistant. Well, of course, what we've seen throughout history is that the more technology we get, the more concentrated the benefits of that get to the owners of businesses and large businesses. So towards the end of the 18, we had the beginnings of the trusts in America, the big monopolies, and that was referred to as the Gilded Age. So we had railroads and we had mining operations, and these corporations were growing immense, and their power grew immense and their wealth grew immense. And then the individuals, the average citizens and the workers, they lost power, and there was a lot of poverty. And the labor movement was born. The first labor movement was born. Unions and all that, dating back to the early 1900s. At the same time, I'm not sure where dentistry was, but the profession of medicine was not really, it wasn't what it is today, or even what it was 50 years ago. There was an awful lot of quackery, and you can, look up all the history, cures what ails you, lots of tinctures and snake oil. Lots of claims that they could cure anything, and there was no basis to it. So we're not even talking about acupuncture and Ayurvedic medicine, or things that have like a 2,000-year cultural history that may have some things right, some things wrong. But we're talking about, a scam artist just kind of pops out of the blue, creates a little concoction and says cures what ails you. Sometimes there's cocaine in it, sometimes there's morphine in it. So this profession of medicine was like all over the place, and you didn't really know who to trust back then. So the Flexner report in 1910, I'm not sure if there's a dentistry equivalent, basically standardized the profession of medicine to 4-year degree, prerequisites, and then eventually requiring residencies and a standard and basis and a biomedical model. There's plenty of criticism about the Flexner report. It was, there was abject racism and sexism because it was 1910. And, it had this biomedical model, but I have my own criticisms because it didn't really teach you about public health or economics or running a practice or a business. So we established this model, and we learned plenty about the Krebs cycle, and then plenty of other more useful things in the Krebs cycle, to be fair. But so it was both critical and maybe an original sin where we didn't learn about some other things. So that closed an awful lot of schools where there were 1 or 2-year degrees that didn't have prerequisites, and you really never knew what you were getting into. And at the same time, the profession of medicine was trying to distance themselves from the snake oil salesman. So we were not allowed to advertise. There was an ethical restriction on advertising because the only advertisers were the ones who were making these false claims, which of course the FTC today, False Claims Act, well, false claims is actually Medicare related, but point is false advertising is not considered acceptable, but we see it all the time. So professional medicine tried to distance itself from that, and at the same time, the labor movement was brewing, and the antitrust movement was coming about into full swing. Now, antitrust is a term that not a lot of people understand because we don't use the term trusts anymore, right? What it should be renamed as is pro-competition or anti-monopoly. We all understand what monopoly is from the game, and of course, it's sort of aggrandized. We in the game, you win if you get a monopoly, right? Which probably should be inverse. We should win if we break up the monopolies and the rest of the people win. But it's sort of, it creates this romantic version where you're the monopolist, but the average person is not the monopolist. We're the monopolized. So 3 things in history: reacting to corporate power, great concentrations of wealth. Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, one of the fathers of the antitrust movement, said we can have great concentrations of wealth in the hands of the few, or we can have democracy, and we cannot have both. And I think that's absolutely true. We can't have this oligopoly or monopoly and have a real democracy. Citizens United, we can get to that later. So the antitrust movement was born, the FTC Act, I think that was 1914, and the labor movement. And then what people don't talk about, and what we're trying to talk about now, is the corporate practice of medicine doctrine. So while physicians started out as independent physicians, literally hanging out a shingle outside their house with their name and their degree, we also had some of these corporations like the the miners and the mining trusts, railroad trusts, they would employ the physicians. Now you're the company doctor. You may have heard that terminology. You don't want the company doctor because you can't trust the company doctor because their salary is dependent on whatever the employer wants, and the employer wants their labor to get back to work. So if you have an employed physician by the company and the patients have to see the employed physician, then there's a good reason not to trust that relationship. Because if the worker comes in with a back injury or a pickaxe injury or perhaps the black lung, whether that's COPD or some kind of form of silicosis, and the physician feels that maybe this worker does need time off or they need treatment. I don't know if there was such thing as workers' comp back then, but the company had a different agenda. And so the physician could not serve two masters, and thus the corporate practice of medicine doctrine was born because there was a realization that this was an ethical dilemma. And that doctrine really started just becoming patchwork state law and prohibitions in certain areas. It originally started with the unlicensed practice of medicine. The snake oil salesman going around and peddling snake oil was unlicensed. To extrapolate from that, a corporation, and I say a lay corporation, not entirely owned by physicians, inherently could not become licensed to practice the medicine. They can't go to school, they can't get the prerequisites, and they're not humans. And so they can't have ethics and they can't have a professional and ethical responsibility to put patients first, which, by the way, AI, also not humans. So AI, under the control of corporations, still falls under the corporate practice of medicine concept and doctrine. That doesn't mean a doctor can't use a tool of AI if they control the practice of medicine. Anyhow, that sort of worked through the 1950s. Still plenty of things wrong with America. We had not had the civil rights, movement, and women only got the right to vote. I think it was 1919. But the economic system allowed your average household to have a single family, a single income, and have the picturesque post World War II Norman Rockwell life without a college degree. And just juxtapose that against today, where you need two working spouses and there's no money for childcare and you still can't afford a house and a car for the average person. So we're way off base right now. They say unions built the middle class, and that's probably true. And the unions got sort of busted down. And then in the 1970s, the profession of medicine and the professions as a whole were essentially, we were demoted from learned profession status to commodity. And fast forward a little bit from there, you have Reaganism, Robert Bork, which is an influential figure in the antitrust world that essentially gutted the original intent of antitrust, to oversimplify. Followed by Reaganism, deregulation, and consolidation of corporate power while demoting the professions. And that was the perfect storm for where we've gotten today. The other profession that was demoted was actually law to some degree. All of the professions were unable to enforce ethical standards on advertising. The thought process was, if we can advertise with our actual fees, then there would be fair market competition and the cost of healthcare would go down. Milton Friedman, the economist, was very influential at this time and thought there should be no licensure for physicians. Licensure is just a barrier that helps them self-protect, and so that we could drive our salaries up, as if the 4 years in medical school and 3 or 4 years in residency and that the undergraduate required prerequisites and all that training really meant nothing. We were just a commodity. So that idealism, that thought process really infiltrated the Federal Trade Commission of the time, and HMOs were on the rise. So the HMO Act of 1973 and actions by the FTC against the American Medical Association said that they could no longer ethically prohibit physicians from entering into contracts with lay organizations. And that lay organization, to begin with, was the HMOs. And so that was the beginning of the end. I just took care of a 93-year-old veteran who happened to also be a surgeon yesterday. If you look back, for a practicing physician that knew what it was like to practice before the HMO Act, you're going back, that physician's got to be at least 80 years old and still practicing. So this gentleman was not practicing, but I had a good conversation with him. Said, good thing he retired in 2000. Good thing I retired when I did. Virtually no physician, alive or practicing, really knows what it was like prior to this. There's virtually no practicing physicians who practiced before the actions of the FTC and the HMO Act, which means that we've lost essentially a collective history. All we can get is, really listening to your elders. And that's why I spent, half an hour talking to this 93-year-old surgeon who I saw as a patient. And, it's instructive. And at this point, we don't know what we didn't have. And the thing is, well, we can talk about this as well. An equitable system where patients, have access to physicians and dentists. I think we do all want that. And there is actually probably a point in history where we could have done it, but instead we let the corporations take over under the guise that they were going to create an equitable system. But today we have an unsustainable system that costs way more than twice, any other nations as a percent of a GDP per person. And we have infant mortality rates going up, and we have life expectancy rates going down, and absurd amounts of chronic disease. And this all followed these actions of the FTC against the profession of medicine, saying that you guys are the problem. It's your salaries that are the problem. Let's hand all of this over to people who didn't take an oath and got their MBA to make as much money as they could, because that seems like a good idea.
This is so interesting, and it's kind of chilling because as you're talking about all of these, it's happening. It's happening in dentistry, and it's the early days. And if we don't learn from what you just told us, who are we? What are we doing? We used to have 80%, 75 to 80% membership through the American Dental Association. Do you know what they're dropped to now? Around 50%. And I tell them on a daily basis, watch what you're doing, because at 30% or lower, you're irrelevant, just like the American Medical Association. We have people in California, in the leadership of the California, that praise the American Medical Association, that we should be more like them. And it's just mind-boggling that we're going through this. What are you doing? What is Take Medicine Back? I know we're doing this because I made an announcement. I'm going to make a bigger announcement regarding the strike coming up in Detroit. And I would love, as you know, I'm not feeling so well. I would have driven myself to Detroit, but I want to try to see if I can get any dentists to go up there and show up in solidarity. We have to support each other. I wanted to tell you this. I'm an animal person, right? My best friend is my dog, right? And that meeting, I have had nightmares when the veterinarian spoke that they have quotas for euthanasia. That means if you don't kill enough animals, you get in trouble. I mean, it's just beyond me that nothing is being done. But hopefully you are, to me, you're a rising star, and we need to support you, and we need to join our forces. I can bring some good people to help.
Absolutely. I mean, with private equity in particular, it is gasoline, it's accelerant on the fire of corporate consolidation. So the professions have been marginalized. I mean, you've seen it. We haven't directly said it. There's the book, I think, The Death of Expertise, this concept, and it does become a cultural shift where the younger generation doesn't even know what a physician is, and they just want to get something, and they know that things are unfair, right? We know it's unfair for the next generation, unfair for my generation, but now you want access to healthcare. And what is that? You don't want the physician, you want the thing, you want the directly advertised medication that you self-diagnosed on WebMD, and then the physician is considered the barrier to getting it. And then you talk to a provider because the corporate terminology makes physicians and professions fungible, right? You don't necessarily have a non-dentistry practitioner. You don't have the dentistry assistant yet, but that corporate push for that.
We do. Some states now are passing these dental therapists.
So I think, like we talked about, dentistry might be 30 to 40 years behind physicians in a good way, in a way that you still have some time. And we talked about the labor movement right now that's within medicine. For the longest time, physicians were told they can't unionize. Lots of psychology went into that. Very little legal stuff went into it. And right now we have pending the first ER, emergency department strike, at least in modern history, definitely of a group employed by private equity, which is actually my alma mater, where I trained in residency, and I watched that group sell to Team Health and then to Blackstone. I watched that in front of my eyes. I watched it all become about the metrics and the money and production, right, while I was a resident. And that's part of my, I call it my villain story of why I'm doing what I'm doing. My attending, who was a first year attending when I was an intern, she started this union. So, and now they're on the verge of a strike. And the strike is very little about money. If time is money, then it's about money, but it's really about time with our patients. So what we definitely want the public to understand is this is about moral injury. The labor movement, the strikes within medicine, these are not about doctors asking for a little bit more money around the margins here, right? This is about physicians standing together against corporate greed so that we can actually spend the time that we need to with the patients and operate in safe working conditions that have enough nurses and support staff. I mean, the physicians are out there asking for more staff, which is the same thing that the nurses are asking for. So we are truly on the same side of this. But it's one of the first, well, I think it's definitely the first union and strike against a private equity group. So one thing I see though is we've been called an alt labor movement. I taught a class at Cornell School of Industry and Labor Relations, which is born out of World War II after the labor unions came into being. But then World War II broke out, and America was like, oh, we got to build tanks all of a sudden, and we got to figure out what to do with the unions because we got to come together as a country. So this school is it's the only one that's really survived as a totally separate school that is solely about industry versus labor relations. So I taught at that school a class about corporate practice of medicine, and I got to meet a lot of the faculty there, and they called us essentially an alternative labor movement, right? I'm not personally unionizing different groups, but we are organizing the voices of professional labor to make a difference. And we have. I think we've been miles more effective than the AMA with a trillionth of the budget, really just sweat equity. And what we're seeing right now is that the traditional union is outdated in terms of the laws and also for professions. So you have a bargaining unit, a legal bargaining unit, which I'm no expert in, but essentially you can unionize the staff at a hospital. But you've got multiple different sites. You've got Team Health that's all over the country. And do you just unionize at one hospital and the hospital doesn't even employ you? Team Health does. And then are you unionizing the physician assistants and the nurse practitioners in, even if they're a separate profession? These are all open questions. But what we see is that the traditional professions, dentistry, medicine, veterinarians, and perhaps pharmacists, there's a natural bargaining unit there with society. There's hey, expertise matters. Time, training, expertise, and ethics matter. Let's take that back. And that's where I see this going, in terms of a political movement.
I definitely agree with that part. And it's, the interesting thing is, Mitch, it's almost, we recently met, and it's so strange because I'm kind of trying to do something similar with my advocacy coalition that I formed. And because I don't really want to collect money, the advocacy is going to have a council and a platform that we're going to influence the ADA to spend the $150 million a year budget on important things. Don't call the corporate practice of dentistry a modality. They are a financing term. I wrote just recently, I'm like, I went to Fifth Third Bank to get the loan to buy my practice. If the ADA is supporting them, then they should be supporting, the corporate entities. So what can we do to help? What is the call to action here?
Yeah. Well, there's specific calls to action and finite ones, right? And I can tell you about what's coming up in the next month, what the calendar looks like. The overall concept is to get the corporate practice of, and we can put that as medicine, dentistry, veterinary medicine, the corporate practice of professions into the public consciousness as part of the discourse. Because we have been, as professions, marginalized. The concept of a profession is marginalized. Even the concept of a trade has been marginalized, right? People don't go into trades anymore. You go to an Ivy League school and you study English or poetry, and then you need that to get a corporate job. We've lost the narrative. So what I think we need to do is move that conversation forward. So we have finite calls to action, but there's also a four-dimensional chess game going on here that we need to raise the conversation into the public consciousness, into the political consciousness about professions. So whether it's the corporate practice of medicine, the corporate practice of dentistry, of veterinary medicine, or of, pharmaceuticals, but the PharmDs, the actual people, pharmacists, we need to draw that line in the sand that we're talking about professions and our professional ethics, which our dentistry and medical associations have really not done us a favor. They have not kept up our professional ethics. So we need a new movement to show that professions matter and have ethics, because otherwise the corporations control the entire narrative. So that's going to be the key for this 5-10 year movement. And along the way, we have ways of raising the profile of that. Right now, there is a cross-government investigation into corporate greed in healthcare. HHS, FTC, DOJ, and the White House. There's now a Senate Committee on Homeland Security investigation into private equity in emergency medicine as a potential national security threat in terms of our inability to respond to a natural or man-made disaster. So these things make news, and as we incorporate the language, we keep the conversation going with the media and with select politicians, nonpartisan movement, bipartisan solutions, but select politicians within that, mostly the populist movement, we start integrating the language. This podcast integrates the language of the corporate practice of medicine and dentistry and makes us think. We haven't thought about that, and it's become the norm. So that's the overall thing. We just need to get the word out. It's got to spread like wildfire, that, this fundamental concepts of that. And that corporate practice of medicine doesn't just necessarily mean not being or being employed by a corporate actor, but it can also mean the payment system. Medicare, CMS, and private insurers, they're feeding the corporate actors. They're funneling taxpayer doctors to organizations that are in violation of the corporate practice of medicine doctrine. So I think it's a unifying concept that has an ethical, legal, and historical basis that every single professional who has any ethics left can get on board with. And so we got to unify around that concept. You don't even have to use the Take Medicine Back name. I didn't invent the corporate practice of medicine. We're reviving it, which is kind of an emergency medicine thing. We're resuscitating it. So we do that, and then we have discrete, strategic work that we're doing. We need to show the narrative that physicians and dentists are still good people, because what we suffer from the sins of our industry. When a dentist under one of the, like, Aspen Dental, they're doing too many procedures, well, that comes back on the dentist and makes it look like the dentists are the ones that are unethical and making all that money. When patients go to the ER and they get a big bill, a big out-of-network bill, and it has my name on it, but I was employed under the corporation who took us out of network and does all the billing and doesn't even show us what's billed or collected in our names. Well, it's partly our fault for shutting our eyes to it, but at the same time, you ask about that and you're going to get fired, right? And your profession, your whole career could be ruined. And so they hold the cards, and then they hang us out to dry to make it look like the profession is the one doing the bad work. So we need to take that narrative back, show that there's professional ethics, and show that these corporations are the ones exploiting us. And then we can take specific political action. And when we turn people out, that's where we're having luck. We get people, we mobilize them, real physicians, to speak at legislative hearings, to submit testimony, and people actually read this. We're so disillusioned by our political process that we think that nothing we do matters. And I think we've proven them wrong. Even if we're not going to fix the system overnight, we've proven them wrong. We can make noise, and people have started to listen to us. And people don't listen to the AMA, even with all their money. They don't listen. The politicians don't really listen to them. Some will take their money, but they've heard the same thing, complaining about Medicare funding for the last 20 years. It's a dead message. So I think we've got real opportunity, and we have, honestly, a very hot iron to strike right now over the next 5 months, and things are moving exponentially. And getting the other professions on board. It's not about getting the ADA on board right away. It's about separating the wheat from the chaff, to get the physicians and the dentists who can open up their brains a little bit to join up, and acknowledging that there's a lot of us who are morally injured and also in difficult positions. So we're empowering those who feel like they could be retaliated against to speak out through pseudonyms. And then when we have physicians who can speak out, we go and we tell the narrative that I'm speaking out and I have been retaliated against. I have lost about 3 years of my income. Others who say I'm lucky because I'm retired, and that's the only reason I can speak out. And then we have 50 physicians who have submitted anonymous testimony that says, I'm afraid for my career, my family, my life. And that starts to move hearts and minds.
I want to stop right here and say, American Dental Association leaders, I know you're watching this. pay really good attention to what Dr. Li just said, right? Pay attention, rewind this and watch it 3, 4, 5 times. When you go to these meetings and you cozy up to DSOs, and when I scream about it and I say the optics are bad, when you go and have association of DSOs basically sponsor your reception at lobby day and have him speak, pay attention what you're doing. We rely on you to lead us. And I know I'm giving a speech here, but you're getting my blood boiled because, you know, again, as I said, we just met a few months ago, and it seems like we were on the same path of what we were trying to do, but you started earlier. We're coming out with big news as far as what's called Dentistry and General Advocacy Coalition, and we're going to hopefully help you and just keep in touch. Do you have anything else you want? First of all, you're still practicing, right? You're practicing where?
Yeah, I still do locums. So as a, real independent contractor, I'm part of the reason I'm in this little 6x10 cargo trailer right now. I do have an apartment, but I decided several years ago after being retaliated against that if I speak out, but I'm trapped in one area and I can't find work, then I'm silenced. So I've made my entire life around being mobile, being flexible, and having multiple sources of stability, not necessarily income, but stability. So I've had a private practice that I'm actually thinking of reopening on a limited basis, small direct care practice. So I'm still practicing. I work currently at a VA hospital, but I'm not, of course, speaking on behalf of them. I still have an independent practice that I started, which I kind of put on hold, but I think I'm going to rekindle that a bit. And I still do locum tenens. That independent practice is not insurance based. It's back to basics. And, in the direct primary care movement, which really just blows up the narrative that healthcare is unaffordable and that physicians are unaffordable, we can do an amazing job just going directly to patients and get people access to high quality care that they never thought was possible. And I still do locum. So I still practice completely full time. And what I'm really hoping to see, I'm excited about what you guys are doing. And we are making room to have dentists and veterinarians really part of the take medicine back movement, because really it is medicine. You're an extended definition of medicine, and you guys have the mouth, and the veterinarians have the other living beings, and the podiatrist can have the feet, because that's getting more gross than the mouth. And so we can have, these are the professions in the health sciences coming together. And the more that legislators, I like this, what Wendy Dean said, when they hear things in stereo, it really, starts to hit. When they hear it in surround sound, you cannot ignore it. So if they hear the corporate practice of dentistry is destroying that world, and the vets say the corporate practice of veterinarian medicine is destroying that world, then, we're going to have an unstoppable movement.
Great. Hey, I want to thank you for being here today. You spent a lot of time with us. I appreciate it, but I want to do this on a regular basis so we can update both groups of what's happening and when we're going. And I'm going to publish where this strike is in Detroit. And I hope dentists who are listening to this are in Detroit area show up. And I'm going to announce it so we can show solidarity with our brothers in medicine and sisters in
Yeah,
medicine.
absolutely. Show up in regale or what, put your white coats on. You guys
Right.
still have those.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you.
For having me.